Hi, this is Jeff Shapiro, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 9th, 2025 issue of the New York Times of the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The justices seem ready to give Trump more power to fire independent government officials. A ruling in the president's favor in the case, which deals with his attempt to remove a member of the Federal Trade Commission, would be a major expansion of presidential authority. The Supreme Court on Monday appeared poised to make it easier for President Trump to fire independent government officials despite laws meant to insulate them from political pressure in what would be a major expansion of presidential power. Hearing a case dealing with Mr. Trump's attempt to oust a member of the Federal Trade Commission, the court's conservative majority seemed ready to overturn or at least strictly limit a landmark decision from 1935. That precedent said that Congress could constrain the president's authority to remove some executive branch officials. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr., who is almost always in the majority in significant cases, said the FTC that opinion shielded 90 years ago looked nothing like the modern commission. Over time, he said, the commission has come to exercise significantly more executive power, an authority that the Constitution generally reserves for the president. He referred to the 1935 precedent as just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was. Even as they appeared receptive to the Trump administration's maximalist position, several key justices seemed intent on making sure that the court's eventual decision in this case did not threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve. The justices will hear a separate case dealing with Mr. Trump's attempt to fire a Fed governor in January. The court's three liberal justices warned of the far reaching consequences for the structure of the modern government if the majority sided with the Trump administration in the Federal Trade Commission matter. A decision in the president's favor, they said, would call into question the constitutionality of job protections extended to leaders of more than 24 over bipartisan commissions and boards. Congress intended to protect these agencies from partisan pressures and charge them with protecting consumers, workers, and the environment. Justice Elena Kagan said that such a ruling would put massive, uncontrolled, unchecked power in the hands of the president. Justice Sonia Sotomayor told the administration's lawyer that you're asking us to destroy the structure of government and to take away from Congress its ability to protect its idea that the government is better structured with some agencies that are independent. In response, D. John Sawyer, the Solicitor General, said that the sky will not fall if the justices give the president this new power. In fact, our entire government will be moved toward accountability to the people, he said. Since returning to the White House, Mr. Trump has fired government watchdogs, leaders of independent agencies, and rank-and-file federal workers, drawing multiple legal challenges. The Supreme Court has generally allowed the firings to take effect through temporary emergency orders. Monday's case presents the first opportunity for the court to issue a conclusive ruling on the underlying legal questions of Mr. Trump's firings. Next month, the justices will separately consider whether the president has the power to fire Lisa Cook, a Fed governor. The justices have allowed Ms. Cook to remain in her post for now, signaling that the central bank may be uniquely insulated from presidential interference because of its history. At issue on Monday was Mr. Trump's firing in March of Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, a Democratic member of the FTC, who attended the argument and listened intently from the courtroom. Mr. Trump said he was removing her because she did not align with his agenda. despite a law that says the president can remove commissioners only for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. Ms. Slaughter promptly sued. Her lawyer, Amit Agarwal of Protect Democracy, told the justices on Monday that presidents of both parties had long accepted that FTC commissioners could not be removed without good cause, in part to ensure regulatory stability. Folks in power today may not be in power tomorrow, and you want a structure that will be able to withstand the test of time, Mr. Agarwal said. He added, presidents have understood and appreciated the vital interests of the American people can be served by having constraints on the exercise of power. Congress intentionally created such bipartisan commissions, made up of experts who could not be fired by the president without cause, to ensure that policy decisions would be made free from politics. The FTC, created in 1914, protects consumers from deceptive practices and monopoly power. It is led by 5 commissioners who have served staggered 7-year terms. No more than 3 can be members of the same party. The FTC has been led by only Republicans since March, after Mr. Trump fired a second Democrat, Alvaro Bedoya. After initially challenging his firing, Mr. Bedoya resigned, citing financial pressures. A district judge said in July that Ms. Slaughter's firing was illegal, and in September, a divided court panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit reinstated her. The panel pointed to the job protections upheld by the 1935 decision that also involved the fired FTC commissioner. In that decision, Humphreys Executor versus U.S., the Supreme Court unanimously upheld removal restrictions for government officials on multi-member boards. The justices in that case said that President Franklin D. Roosevelt could not remove a member of the FTC merely because of political differences. But in the last 15 years, the court has repeatedly narrowed that decision to give the president more control over executive officials. The court found in 2020 that the structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was unconstitutional because it did not allow the president to fire its single director without cause. The court allowed the job protections to remain for multi-member bodies like the FTC. But in its emergency orders issued this year, the conservative majority has let the president temporarily remove leaders of agencies led by such multi-member boards, including the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. As a result, Mr. Sawyer told the justices that the president at issue stands as an indefensible outlier and must be overruled. It continues to tempt Congress to erect at the heart of our government a headless fourth branch insulated from political accountability and democratic control, he said. Throughout the lively 2-hour argument, the justices appeared divided among ideological lines with questions that underscored their starkly different visions of the president's powers and the role and history of independent agencies. Liberal justices pointed to recent historical scholarship showing that Congress has long had the power to divide such agencies and fill them with nonpartisan experts. Congress is saying expertise matters, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said. So having a president come in and fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them with loyalists and people who don't know anything is actually not in the best interest of the citizens of the United States. Conservative justices, in turn, expressed concern about independent agencies exercising vast power over individuals and billion-dollar industries without being accountable to the president, who has authority over the executive branch. I think broad deregulations to unaccountable independent agencies, raising enormous constitutional and real world problems for individual liberty, Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh said. But it was unclear exactly how the court's eventual decision would affect agencies beyond the FTC. Several justices, including Gorsuch and Chief Justice Roberts, were critical of the reasoning in the 1935 decision, which dealt specifically with the Trade Commission. But, the Chief Justice said, that does not mean that the other agencies fall with it as well. Still, if the administration prevails, Mr. Agarwal said everything is on the chopping block, warning that it will include the independence of the Federal Reserve. Samuel Alito pushed back on claims that the Trump administration's legal arguments would lead to revolutionary results. Justice Kavanaugh more than once suggested that the court would carve out an exception to preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve based on the central bank's history. There were echoes on Monday of the Supreme Court's ruling last year in another major case involving Mr. Trump. The conservative majority's decision in Trump v. U.S. gave the president immunity from prosecution for his official actions. But the administration relied on it throughout the argument to bolster its expansive view of presidential power. Justice Thomas asked the Solicitor General whether there were any limits on the president's authority to fire leaders of multi-member commissions, even for arbitrary reasons. Mr. Sawyer responded by invoking the immunity decision. No, he said, this court in Trump against the United States held that the president's power to remove officers wielding the executive power is inclusive and preclusive. China's trade surplus climbs past $1 trillion for the first time. President Trump's tariffs weren't enough to hold back the global export flood by China, which pushed past last year's record in just 11 months. China got the world's attention last January when it announced that its trade surplus for goods and services had hit almost $1 trillion, an excess of exports to imports that no country had ever reached. Now, China has surged through that milestone in just 11 months this year. China's customs agency announced on Monday that the country's accumulated trade surplus reached $1.08 trillion through November. Tariffs imposed by President Trump on China have caused the Chinese exports to the United States to drop by nearly a fifth. But China has throttled back its purchases of American soybeans and other products by almost the same rate, continuing to sell 3 times as much to the United States as it buys. China's $111.68 billion trade surplus in November was its third largest ever in a single month. The overall surplus through the first 11 months of the year was up 21.7% from the same period last year. China has ramped up considerably its sales to other countries, from cars to solar panels to consumer electronics. A tsunami of Chinese exports is flooding Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Car makers and other exporters in traditional manufacturing powerhouses like Germany, Japan, and South Korea are losing customers to Chinese rivals. Factories in developing countries like Indonesia and South Africa have had to curtail production or even close as they've struggled to match China's low prices. Chinese companies have shifted final assembly of their goods to Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Africa, which then ship finished products to the United States. This has allowed them to partly bypass Mr. Trump's tariffs on goods coming straight from China. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. China now sells more than twice as much to the European Union as it buys. China's trade surplus with the region has widened considerably this year. One major reason is that China's currency has been weak over the last several years against many other currencies, particularly the euro. Another is that prices have been falling in China while they've been rising in the United States and Europe. The weakness of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, has helped propel its exports. More than a tenth of the Chinese economy now consists of its trade surplus in manufactured goods. Europe has felt the sting sharply. With the renminbi undervalued by 30% against the euro, possibly more, it will be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to compete against Chinese manufacturers, even if Europe does all the right things it needs to do in terms of deregulation, bringing down energy prices, and establishing a true unified market, said Jens Escohn, the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. China's trade surplus in factory goods is even bigger as a share of its economy than the one the United States ran in the years immediately after World War II, when most other manufacturing nations were in ruins, or during the early years of World War I, when the United States was at peace and churning out civilian goods while Europe was embroiled in war. Top leaders of the International Monetary Fund, which monitors economies with the aim of preventing crisis, are making their annual visit to China this week to review its currency and financial policies, and are expected to announce a preliminary summary of their findings on Wednesday. A growing number of economists and business leaders, including former senior officials at China's own central bank, are calling on Beijing to let the renminbi increase in value against the dollar and other currencies. For China, a strong renminbi would make goods like gas, French wines, or Japanese cosmetics cheaper to import. Savings on such purchases would leave China's households with more money to spend on Chinese goods and services like restaurant meals, concert tickets, and electric cars. Reviving consumer spending in China is one of the top goals of Beijing leaders. But doing so, by allowing the renminbi to strengthen, would also carry costs for China. A stronger renminbi would hurt China's exporters. The dollars that they earn by selling goods in foreign markets would yield fewer renminbi for them to pay workers and other expenses. Factories create millions of jobs in China, and a stronger renminbi could slow the rate at which other countries transfer manufacturing to China. China's export success has also financed the boom in technological innovation, and has given Beijing the resources to help other authoritarian countries when they encounter difficulties, notably Russia, North Korea, and Iran. China is trying to preserve its trade surplus by pressing other countries not to erect trade barriers. Protectionism cannot solve the problems caused by global industrial restructuring, but will only worsen the international environment for trade, Xi Jinping, China's top leader, said on Thursday, according to a Chinese government summary of his meeting with President Emmanuel Macron of France. Some Chinese economists nonetheless say that China must someday accept a narrower trade surplus to help its long-suffering consumers. For China to expand domestic demand, it is necessary to minimize the trade surplus, and in the future it may even need to consider maintaining a trade deficit, Chang Jun, dean of the School of Economics at Fudan University in Shanghai, said in a speech last month. $18,000 reasons that it's so hard to build a chip factory in America. The transformation of Phoenix into a semiconductor hub by Taiwan's TSMC illustrates the difficulties of large-scale projects in the United States. The computer chip factories rising from an empty expanse of the Sonoran Desert tests the concept of immensity. The complex is under construction across 1,149 acres, an area that's larger than New York Central Park. It represents an investment of $165 billion, making it one of the most expensive undertakings on Earth. Here, on the northern edges of Phoenix, stands a display of the American reach for industrial self-sufficiency. The factories are engineered to make advanced computer chips, the brains of modern manufacturing. Those chips will power data centers that deliver artificial intelligence. American political leaders celebrate the presence of the plants as insurance against geopolitical turmoil and disasters like pandemics. Whatever happens, the nation will have its own supply of computer chips. But the company at the center of this enterprise, one cast as vital to national security, is not American. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, the global leader in the industry, has marshaled the investment, the people, and the know-how to turn these plans into reality. Scores of other companies, some of them American, but many from East Asia, have set up their own local factories to supply TSMC with everything that it needs, from chemicals and components to construction and engineering services. Collectively, they have invested an additional $40 billion in the local economy. This is the inescapable truth behind the transformation of Phoenix into a hub for computer chips. It could never have happened without the expertise and money brought in from across the Pacific. The last major domestic chip plant came online in 2013, so the United States lacks the experience to build one without considerable help. And even with that assistance, the experience has been tumultuous, fraught with missteps, and enormously expensive. The process that has turned a blank spot on the map into what some now call the Silicon Desert underscores a defining feature of American life. A tangle of bureaucracy often hinders ambitious visions, sowing confusion, uncertainty, and delay. That tends to reinforce inertia and discourage development. West of Phoenix, in a community near the TSMC complex, Kathy Parloheim and her neighbors had no interest in becoming participants in a national crusade to make computer chips. Miss Parloheim, who's 65 years old, lives on a reddish-brown landscape dotted by cactuses and wildflowers. She bought her home a decade ago. It was about the peace, the serenity, the solitude, she said. There's a magical feeling here. Last year, she learned that Amkor Technology was planning to construct a so-called advanced semiconductor packaging plant nearby. It would assemble chips made by TSMC. She and other residents were horrified. They envisioned tractor trailers bearing toxic chemicals and a massive draw on scarce local water. They mobilized in opposition. They won. Amkor moved to another site. The face-off between concerned homeowners and a factory with implications for national resilience is emblematic of broader forces constraining American aspirations. Here is part of the explanation for delays at computer chip clusters from New York to Ohio to Texas. Here is why companies around the globe are reluctant to make things in the United States, fearing a bewildering array of regulations and trouble finding workers. At home in Taiwan, TSMC is used to moving aggressively, gaining whatever resources, personnel, and government approvals are required in order to propel its astonishing expansion. Yet in Phoenix, TSMC and its suppliers have wrestled with the intricacies of a different system. They've been tripped up by a confusing process to gain permits. They've struggled to find workers with needed skills. They've contended with higher costs of doing business, succeeding through force of will and vast sums of money. Under pressure to build factories in the United States, TSMC has already completed one so-called fab, a plant now producing chips, while continuing construction of two more. It's outlined plans for three more factories at the Phoenix site, plus a pair of advanced packaging facilities. When these plans are completed, the company expects to make nearly one-third of its advanced chips in the United States. We knew it was going to be really hard, said Rose Castaneras, president of TSMC Arizona, during a recent interview. We've learned from that. The challenge speaks to the complexities of exporting a successful model from the opposite side of the Pacific to the United States. It also attests to dimensions of American governments. President Trump has vowed to spur a revival in American manufacturing as a centerpiece of his economic plans. He's leaned heavily on tariffs as the way to force companies to set up factories in the United States and hire American workers. He's effectively bet that the allure of making goods inside the world's largest consumer marketplace would be enough to overcome other challenges. But the simplicity of that prescription confronts the reality that the United States lacks workers and needed skills. 3 years ago, as TSMC prepared to set up in Phoenix, its founder, Morris Chang, noted that the cost of making chips at a smaller factory in Washington state were 50% higher than in Taiwan. He envisioned a similar situation in Arizona. It will be very expensive exercise in futility, Mr. Chang said in an interview with the Brookings Institution, adding that it will be non-competitive in the world market. In Taiwan, TSMC and its suppliers build factories in dedicated industrial zones that generally require one permit from a central authority. In Arizona, they must negotiate municipal, county, state, and federal regulations requiring thousands of approvals. Every step requires a permit, and after the permit is approved, it takes twice as long as in Taiwan. TSMC's chief executive and chairman, C.C. Wei, said this year at National Taiwan University. The company was required to gain permits from city and county authorities to comply with state and federal regulations. And in many instances, regulations for its industry did not even exist at the local level, so TSMC had to convene a team of experts to craft its own language and gain approvals. We ended up establishing 18,000 rules, which cost us $35 million, Mr. Wei said. Such laments stem from an extraordinary American success. Over decades, the United States has used regulation to reduce air and water pollution while enhancing workplace safety. Yet bureaucracies have grown around those rules, often in incoherent fashion. Some of the main issues that hold back U.S. manufacturing have very little to do with substantive environmental standards, said Thomas Hochman, Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Foundation for American Innovation, a Silicon Valley-aligned research organization. He cited the National Environmental Policy Act, which directs federal agencies to consider and evaluate the impacts of projects, but does not compel action. It does not say, you cannot pollute X, Mr. Hochman said. It does not say, you cannot discharge Y. It says, you need to do the paperwork. Environmentalists challenge that depiction, arguing that paperwork requirements play a vital role in forcing agencies to put on record how developments affect the natural sphere. The law also requires the authorities to consider less harmful alternatives. Some argue that the challenges in Phoenix attest more to the special treatment of the semiconductor industry in East Asia than shortcomings in the United States. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In Taiwan, economic growth is dominated by chip making, so the government is focused on making everything streamlined, said Chris Miller, an economic historian at Tufts University and author of the best-selling book Chip War. It wouldn't be rational for us to change everything to suit the chip industry. The president The presence of TSMC in Phoenix reflects a reassessment of geopolitical risks. No one at its headquarters in Taiwan stared at the globe and concluded that Phoenix was the most suitable place to make chips. Rather, the company responded to its customers. TSMC does not design chips, it makes them for businesses like Apple and NVIDIA, the company at the center of explosive growth in artificial intelligence. In recent years, TSMC's customers have grown worried about its dependence on factories in Taiwan, a self-governing island claimed by China. What if Beijing unleashes its military to seize control, disrupting the supply of chips? With such fears in mind, TSMC has been constructing factories around the world, including in Germany and Japan. One of TSMC's largest customers urged the company to set up an advanced manufacturing plant in the United States. They asked us before the pandemic, Ms. Castanera said. We just do what our customers ask us to do. The Biden administration was intent on diminishing American reliance on faraway factories. It sought to attract computer chip manufacturers by earmarking more than $52 billion in subsidies via the CHIPS and Science Act. The funding included $6.6 billion for TSMC. The Arizona Commerce Authority, an economic development agency, courted the company, highlighting the state's legacy as a center of semiconductor production. Motorola began making computer chips in the area in the mid-1950s. Intel opened a fab in Chandler in 1980. Arizona State University promoted its industry expertise and aggressive expansion plans. And over the last 15 years, the ranks of its engineering students have grown to 33,000 from 6,000. We're saying certain things we must manufacture here, no matter what, said Michael Crow, the university's president. We haven't thought like that except during times of war. But nothing gets built in Phoenix without reckoning with water. Shortages have prompted state and local authorities to limit development. Chip plants require enormous amounts of water. The first 3 TSMC factories were expected to need a collective 16.4 million gallons per day, about as much as consumed by 200,000 homes. TSMC says it expects to draw little of that from municipal supplies. The company is building a wastewater treatment plant that it says will eventually recycle nearly all of its water. The area offered huge undeveloped tracts and a conducive climate. Summer temperatures exceed 110, yet the weather is predictable and largely free of disasters like floods and tornadoes. By the spring of 2024, TSMC had committed to build 3 factories in Phoenix while investing $65 billion. Then, President Trump returned to office, gaining the company's commitment to more than double its plans. He cast TSMC as the centerpiece of his campaign to elevate American manufacturing. Making computer chips is an industrial magic trick. Billions of microscopic transistors are crammed onto slivers of silicon using a process something like the creation of a photographic negative. Machinery casts beams of light so slender that a human hair may be 5,000 times as thick. But installing that equipment and getting it to work properly requires people with specialized training and experience. 2 years ago, TSMC acknowledged that it was having trouble finding local people who knew how to do it. The company actually brought in more than 500 experienced workers from Taiwan. Local unions accused TSMC of breaching the spirit and rules of its federal subsidies. They urged immigration authorities to block visa for the Taiwanese workers. The company resolved the conflict by committing to show preference to American workers, but labor disputes have continued. A lawsuit brought by 28 former and current TSMC employees at facilities in Arizona and California accuses the company of relying on Taiwanese senior managers who sideline American workers by conducting business in China while denigrating local hires. The lawsuit depicts dangerous conditions inside the fabs. It asserts that TSMC reflexively brings in workers from Taiwan rather than investing in training local people. They're under the impression that American workers are lazy, incompetent, and stupid, said David Amiri, 34, one of the plaintiffs, who spent 2 years at TSMC as a fire protection engineer. It was easier for them to just do it rather than teach someone to do it. TSMC declined to discuss the lawsuit, and in a statement, the company said it is committed to providing a safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment for our employees. The local company president, Ms. Caceres, acknowledged tensions between the impulse to move faster and taking the time to develop a local workforce. We're trying to find that balance, she said. Most of the 3,000 employees at the fab were hired in the United States, the company said. Local consultants, lawyers, and real estate agents who work for the company say that TSMC's managers are under pressure to meet deadlines set at headquarters in Taiwan. Hiring people who lack Chinese fluency and familiarity with the company's ways invites miscommunication. Local construction companies are unacquainted with specialized techniques developed in Taiwan, including a process to lay out and join pipes. There's been a massive learning curve for contractors in the United States, said Hassan Khan, a director of economic security in the CHIPS program office during the Biden administration. TSMC had a finely tuned ecosystem in Taiwan. They had protocols. When they came here, the ecosystem didn't exist. In Taiwan, TSMC operates in what many describe as paternalistic fashion, extending job security and training to its workers in exchange for selfless dedication. Employees are expected to drop family activities when needed at the plant. American workers operated with a more codified sense of rights. It's two different worlds, said Mindy Wu, president of W Consulting and Company, which works with incoming TSMC suppliers. American workers expect to go home at a promised hour or receive overtime. With Taiwanese companies said, the boss expects you to stay and finish the job. TSMC and its suppliers were surprised by the challenges of development in the American Southwest. They came in so fast they didn't really know the rules of the game, said G.R.W. Plank, the founder and managing partner of Archon, a Phoenix architectural firm that has worked with TSMC suppliers. They didn't know what they didn't know. Arizona authorities required that the company survey its site to ensure that it was free of desert tortoises. The city of Phoenix demanded that TSMC identify and replant protected species of desert flora. Last year, the Environmental Protection Agency notified Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix, that it intended to reclassify the local ozone threat as serious. That would have made it far harder for TSMC to gain Clean Air Act approvals. Under President Trump, the agency loosened its standards. When Mr. Amari joined TSMC in June 2022, he assumed the company would value his knowledge of applicable safety codes. He had spent 3+ years as a Phoenix fire inspector. The company had to expand the sprinkler system, he told the supervisors. Some of the structures had spaces where the roof jutted out beyond the outer wall, and sprinklers had to be installed overhead. This was a substantive issue of safety, he said. But the Taiwanese manager he approached about this dismissed his concerns. They wanted a copy in the U.S. exactly how they do it in Taiwan, he said. They didn't change a single bit of their design. An inspector for TSMC Insurance Company later noted the defect and demanded that it be remedied, Mr. Amari said, and the cost ran 6 figures. In June of 2024, he quit in frustration. Linde, a company that pumps pristine air into TSMC fabs, erected a plant next door to the factories, including a $45 million pipeline. Linde needed 150 permits for the pipeline alone, Mr. Plank said. A permit was required to pile extra dirt left from grading the site. Each permit entailed as many as 15 inspections. The company had to gain permission from the Federal Aviation Administration for a tower. The city insisted that Linde get a letter from a nearby shooting range promising that ammunition would not be fired in the direction of its plant. Amcor, the chip packaging company, was more than just another supplier. It was a missing piece to the whole puzzle. Advanced packaging takes freshly manufactured chips and fits them together for use in devices like consumer electronics. They are one of the big anchors, said Michael Rosas, a vice president of the Arizona Commerce Authority. And in late 2023, Amcor announced plans to build a $2 billion plant in Peoria, a city just west of the TSMC complex. We need to be close to the manufacturers, Amcor's chief operating officer Kevin Engel said in an interview. The project gained a $400 million federal grant via the CHIPS Act. The company is yet to receive the money, which is based on achieving milestones, but expressed confidence that it would. The Peoria City Council approved a development agreement with Amcor in February 2024. The plant was to be built in the middle of 320 acres slated for housing, restaurants, and office space. Residents cried foul. How is a factory compatible with the surroundings? City officials offered assurances. The tallest building would be no higher than 54 feet, they said. Yet by January, the planned factory had doubled in height, while expanding across more than 4 times the initial square footage. Amcor was under pressure to add capacity to accommodate TSMC's growing demand for AI chips, Mr. Engel said. Its investment had swelled to $7 billion. Residents of the Vicinettia community jammed Peoria City Council meetings, demanding a halt to the factory and threatening legal action. Publicly, the city held firm. Jason Beck, the Peoria mayor, had made the Amcor plant a major economic development goal. Behind the scenes, he pursued a deal by which the city bought a larger, more remote parcel via a state land auction. The company recently broke ground at the new site. Sometimes things get ugly, Mr. Beck said. A few miles to the east, at the TSMC site, glass-fronted offices glistened in the sun as towering cranes moved supplies across the pale soil. Earth movers tore at the land, sending clouds of dust skyward. Across a freshly paved street, the Mack Real Estate Group, the company behind Manhattan's Time Warner Center, was developing an entire city, Halo Vista, across 2,300 acres. Its first phase, expected to break ground early next year, will center on a hotel, big box retailers, car dealerships, restaurants, and gyms. Subsequent waves over the next 2 decades are to include industrial zones, offices, and 9,000 housing units. The development is premised on the idea that TSMC's suppliers will continue to follow the company to Phoenix. Inside TSMC's complex on a recent afternoon, a stage had been assembled in the center of an atrium for a ceremony to mark production of advanced AI chips from one of its most important customers, the Silicon Valley behemoth NVIDIA. Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's founder, entered the building, sending a palpable jolt through the facility. Employees gasped and cheered. Many pressed against the balconies to catch a glimpse of the man behind the demand for what they were building. They held up their phones for photos. This is a very big day for America, Mr. Huang said from a lectern. This is only the beginning. He gazed up at the workers assembled at the balconies. He noted the fact that many had come from far away. None of this would have been possible, he said, if not for so many Taiwanese families that made your journeys to the United States. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A weakened Hamas still dominates Gaza, building day by day. A ceasefire after 2 years of war with Israel has allowed Hamas to tighten its grip on power again. It's still standing, one Israeli official said. Since Israeli forces withdrew from parts of Gaza in October under a ceasefire agreement, Hamas has moved quickly to fill the void. Its police forces are out on the streets again. Its fighters have executed opponents. and its officials have levied fees on some costly goods being imported into Gaza, according to local businessmen. Over 2 years of war, top Hamas commanders and thousands of fighters have been killed, and the group's arsenal has been severely depleted. It now controls less than half of the territory in Gaza, with the rest occupied by Israel. Yet Hamas has managed to reassert its power in Gaza, according to Israeli security officials and an Arab intelligence official. They spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss internal assessments. Hamas was hit hard, but it wasn't defeated, said Shalom Ben-Hanan, a former senior official in the Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence agency. Is still standing. This swift regrouping presents a formidable obstacle to the Trump administration's plan to reconstruct a Gaza free of Hamas. The plan envisions the enclave's demilitarization and calls for all military infrastructure, including tunnels and weapons production facilities, to be destroyed. Hamas emerged from the war with a foundation that it can build on. Mr. Ben-Hanan, who receives briefings from the Shin Bet leadership, said that even though Hamas's ranks are thinned, official estimates say that 20,000 fighters still remain. Hamas has quickly replaced the commanders killed in the war, said Brigadier General Erez Winter, who served in a senior role in the Israeli military until March. The group has many places to hide and store weapons, given that more than half of the underground tunnel network is still intact, the Israeli and Arab officials said. Hamas still runs the central organs of government in Gaza, including the security services, Mr. Ben-Hanan said. Its rocket supply has dwindled, but members still have lighter weapons like automatic rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. Hamas gunmen are operating checkpoints in parts of Gaza and questioning and detaining people, according to residents. Its police have prevented people from trying to steal from aid trucks and abandoned homes, they said. They're trying to convey to the public that they're still in charge and that they're providing security, said Nidal Kuhal, who's 31 years old, a resident of Gaza City. You can feel their presence, but they also appear to be weaker than the past. Hassan Badran, a senior Hamas official, said that the group was prepared to allow a committee of Palestinian technocrats to take over the administration of Gaza. Chaos would be the result of leaving behind a power vacuum, he said. That would be the most dangerous decision, he said in an interview. The police, he added, were seeking to preserve security and stability. Still, Hamas has used brutal tactics to settle scores with their rivals. In mid-October, members of the group forced 8 men to kneel in a crowded street in Gaza City before shooting them dead. Hamas internal security officials said the deaths were in retaliation for the killing of several Hamas militants during the war. On Thursday, Yasser Abu Shabab, the leader of a Palestinian militia backed by Israel, was killed in a clash in eastern Rafah. Though it was not clear whether Hamas was involved, the group cheered the news. As Hamas has tried to establish security, it has also sought to raise money from the ceasefire. Since the truce took effect, hundreds of trucks carrying humanitarian aid and commercial goods have been entering Gaza daily, a sharp increase from wartime. Hamas has been generating revenue from some of the more costly items flowing in by levying taxes on a small number of commercial goods, such as computers and solar panels, according to 4 Gaza businessmen. Ismail Touabath, the Director General of the Hamas-controlled government media office in Gaza, denied that the Hamas government was collecting any taxes on imported goods. Despite its partial comeback, Hamas clearly does not wield the power that it did before October 7, 2023, when it was a fully fledged militia and government that controlled Gaza with an iron fist. The half of Gaza that it now presides over was demolished by the war. The Trump administration has refused to consider reconstructing parts of Gaza that remain under Hamas authority. Israeli officials say much of the group's funding has also been cut off. More important, Hamas is facing more pressure than ever from both Israel and the international community to give whatever arms it still has. The Trump plan for Gaza is predicated on Hamas's disarmament and a new government taking over the territory's administration with the support of an international stabilization force. Mr. Badran said Hamas was ready to discuss the issue of the group's weapons, but only in the context of serious talks about a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, a total halt to military operations in the territory, and the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Without that, talking about these matters would be nonsensical, he said, without value. He also suggested that Hamas was open to a long-term truce. For Hamas, giving up all its weapons would be tantamount to giving up a core element of its identity, the ability to resist Israel. Beyond its ideological attachment to its weapons, Hamas members view them as critical for self-defense, said Wassam Afifa, a Palestinian analyst and the former executive director of Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV. Palestinian analysts said that they thought Hamas might take a pragmatic approach to preserve some sort of future role in Gaza and a long-term ceasefire with Israel. While a long-term truce is possible, Mr. Afifa said a wholesale surrender is not in the offering. Some Arab mediators said that they believe they can persuade Hamas to give up some of its weapons as long as President Trump offers guarantees that Israel will not restart the war. Senior members of the Israeli government have indicated that they would probably not settle for a partial Hamas disarmament, noting that it would not be in keeping with the U.S. vision. This territory will be demilitarized and Hamas will be disarmed, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel told a government meeting in mid-November. Either this will happen the easy way or it will happen the hard way. Israeli political and military officials have complained that with each passing day of the ceasefire, Hamas is deepening its control and reorganizing its forces, making it harder to introduce a viable alternative to replace it. It happened very quickly, Moshe Torpaz, a centrist Israeli lawmaker, said of Hamas's resurgence. The moment to bring in the new government was the moment that the ceasefire started, said Mr. Torpaz, a member of Israel's Parliamentary Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which receives classified briefings on security affairs. Hamas was at its weakest. The slow process of setting up a new government for Gaza is playing right into Hamas's favor, he said. Mr. Ben-Hanan, the former Shin Bet official, warned that Hamas could pose a threat again in the future if Israel becomes complacent about the group. Hamas is besieged, he said, but it continues controlling parts of Gaza and wants to rebuild its capacities. It will find a way to rebuild them. He added that the next battle might be in 10 or 20 years, but it could be much worse than October 7th. Paramount makes a hostile bid for Warner Brothers Discovery. The offer to shareholders comes days after Warner Brothers agreed to sell its streaming and studio business to Netflix. Paramount on Monday mounted a hostile takeover bid for Warner Brothers Discovery, a brazen attempt to secure a Hollywood prize snatched away by Netflix last week. Netflix announced an $83 billion deal to buy a big part of Warner Brothers Discovery on Friday in an agreement approved by the boards of both companies. In a news release on Monday, Paramount went around the Warner Brothers Discovery board and straight to the shareholders with what it called a superior offer. Paramount said it would buy $30 per share in cash, would pay $30 per share in cash, valuing the company at around $108 billion, including debt. It said it was going to shareholders because the board of Warner Brothers Discovery is pursuing an inferior proposal that will lead to a challenging regulatory approval process. Paramount has offered to buy all of Warner Brothers Discovery, including the Warner Brothers Movie Studio, the HBO Max streaming service, and a portfolio of cable channels, including CNN. The cable channels are not part of the Netflix deal. We believe our offer would create a stronger Hollywood, David Ellison, the chief executive of Paramount, said in a press release. It's in the best interest of the creative community, consumers, and the movie theater industry. In a statement, Warner Brothers Discovery said that it received the bid and would respond within 10 business days, advising the shareholders not to take any immediate action. Still, it said the hostile bid had not brought about any immediate changes. The board is not modifying its recommendation with respect to the agreement with Netflix, he said. Paramount's hostile takeover attempt is the latest in a series of increasingly strident overtures to Warner Brothers Discovery in recent weeks. Just before Netflix announced that it had struck a deal, Paramount sent a letter to David Zaslav, the chief executive of Warner Brothers Discovery, alleging that the company ran a myopic sale process that favors a single bidder. Warner Brothers Discovery said in a response that it fully and robustly complied with its obligations to its shareholders. The company ran a weeks-long bidding process that also drew interest from Comcast, the cable company that owns NBC Universal. Warner Brothers Discovery stock closed at $26 a share on Friday after its deal with Netflix was announced. It rose nearly 5% on Monday morning after Paramount announced that its hostile bid to $27.30 a share. A key part of the assessment for shareholders will be whether they expect regulatory authorities to approve the transaction. The deal between Netflix and Warner Brothers Discovery would include the Warner Brothers Movie Studio and HBO Max, enhancing Netflix's market power in streaming even more. At the Kennedy Center Honors on Sunday, President Trump praised Ted Sarandos, the co-chief executive of Netflix, but noted that the company had a very big market share, adding that he would be involved in the regulatory review. It is highly unusual for a president to have a direct say on major corporate deals, which are typically reviewed by independent regulators at a distance from politicians' input. Another wrinkle the Paramount disclosed on Monday was that Affinity Partners, the private equity firm founded by Mr. Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, was lined up as an investor to back the offer. On a conference call Monday, Mr. Ellison said that Paramount decided to take its offer directly to shareholders after Warner Brothers Discovery failed to respond to it last week. Mr. Ellison also said that he told Mr. Zaslav that Paramount's proposal was not in its best and final offer. Mr. Ellison was also critical of Netflix's chance of getting the deal through regulatory review. The company has a big share of the streaming business, Mr. Ellison said, even if it might argue that the market for overall TV viewership is broader. Saying that streaming is not a market is a little bit like looking at the beverage market and saying that Coke and Pepsi can merge because Budweiser is a replacement to it, he said. Hostile takeover bids are relatively uncommon at the top of the media industry, where cozy relationships among the moguls and special classes of stock often make them impractical. But there is some precedent. Brian Roberts, the chief executive of Comcast, attempted a hostile takeover of Disney in 2004 as that company was embroiled in shareholder tumult. The bid was ultimately unsuccessful. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from December 9, 2025 issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.